Hi, everyone. We'll be starting soon. We're just giving a few more moments for people to filter in. Hi, everyone. I'm Craig Jones. I'm the Associate Director of the Housing Research Collaborative and the Housing Assessment Resource Tools Project at GBC. I've also had a lot of involvement with the Balanced Supply of Housing node of CMHC's Collaborative Housing Research Network. So really pleased to be here. It's great to have you with us. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm located is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I invite you to use the chat and Q&A function to acknowledge the land on which you are currently located. So as a researcher who has focused on evictions for really the better part of 10 years, I think that evictions is a really important area for us to focus our energy on research because there are significant research gaps. We know relatively little about evictions, and I would argue we know even less about their effects. And so today, as part of this Balanced Supply of Housing Research in Progress webinar, we're going to be joined by two researchers who will talk about the evictions research that they have been doing. And both of these projects were funded by the Balanced Supply Node, which is also funded by CMHC. So first is Dimitri Panou, who will be speaking about evictions in Hogan's Alley, which is an historically Black neighborhood in the city of Vancouver. And second will be Alina McKay, who will be speaking about the results of an upcoming report from the Balanced Supply of Housing, Filling the Gaps, Evictions, and Government Policy in Metro Vancouver during COVID-19. So Dimitri, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Craig. So as mentioned, my name is Dimitri, and I am an undergraduate student at Toronto Metropolitan University in the Urban and Regional Planning program. And I'm also a research assistant for Dr. Nemoy Lewis, who is the principal investigator on this study. So the research I'll be presenting today is not exactly about evictions, but it's more to do with additional rental increases in BC. And so this is part of a Hogan's Alley Society Housing Solutions Lab report. And the section that we authored of that report was called The Rise of Corporate Investments in the Metro Vancouver Rental Market. Our partners on this project were Wood Buffalo Strategy Group, the City of Vancouver, BC Housing, and our funder was CMHC and the Balanced Supply of Housing. Okay, so we received additional rent increase data from the British Columbia Residential Tenancy Branch. And this data was only available through a Freedom of Information request. So that was one of the challenges that we ran into. Further, the Residential Tenancy Branch only they did not provide the address or the postal codes of properties that were subject to these additional rental increases. They did that for citing privacy concerns. However, these additional rental increases are subject to the whole building, so we're not sure whose privacy they were protecting in this. And in the database that was provided to us, the owners were often misspelled or incorrect, so it required a lot of sort of combing through. And so I'll just briefly go over like our research question with this broader project when we started. So we were trying to understand sort of the influence of financialized landlords in the Metro Vancouver rental market and their potential impact on Black and other economically disenfranchised renters in the primary rental market. And we wanted to know how these landlords might influence the housing choices and lived experiences of Black renters in the market. and how various categories of landlords, specifically financialized landlords, are influencing the rental experience as a result of their acquisition patterns and their management practices. And specifically for this presentation, the management practice we'll be talking about is their pursuit of additional rent increases. So we obtained all of the ARI data for Metro Vancouver between 2021 and 2023. This policy came into effect July 2021 in BC. And so all of this information that we received included the location, but that, like I said, it was just the municipality, nothing more, and the number of units that were impacted. And so what we did was we took the number of units that were impacted and the location, and we sort of brought those two pieces together and used our commercial real estate platform to determine what the actual addresses were of the properties. And so we were able to find them for a good amount. There were about 108 ARI applications filed in this period, and we were able to find the addresses for 59 of them. However, for financialized landlords, we were actually able to find a vast majority of the addresses. So I've been talking about additional rent increases, but I should clarify what the difference is between those and AGIs, which are in Ontario. So the AGI policy in Ontario, that came first in 1997. And then the ARI policy came into effect in 2021, and it was actually largely modeled on the AGI policy. We had a conversation with a director of the residential tenancy branch who informed us of that. And so part of the reason that the ARI policy came into effect was that in 2018, the province of British Columbia changed their yearly provincial increase formula. So previously it was the rate of inflation plus 2%. And so in 2018, they changed that to just the rate of inflation. And so they brought in this ARI policy as a way to sort of incentivize landlords to maintain their properties. And what that looks like is tenants are paying for this. So they're paying a maximum of 9% that's spread out over 3 years. And that's the same as the AGIs in Ontario. And so that 9% is not inclusive of the provincial guideline increase. So let's say the provincial guideline increase tied to inflation was 2% for 3 years in a row, and they achieved the maximum of 9%. Your rent could be going up by 5% each year for 3 years. So it's quite a bit. And like I said, the tenants are paying for these things. So we can see the two eligibility requirements for each policy. I'm not going to read all of that. I'll just leave it there for you to read. But something with the ARI policy that we did here was that they stressed that these are not expenditures that are related to cosmetic renovations. So these are supposed to be major expenditures, fixing, replacing, and installing major systems. However, like early analysis from the Vancouver Tenants Union, as well as findings from people who are living in these properties, suggest that landlords might be pursuing ARIs for more cosmetic reasons, or lumping them in with other larger capital expenditures. And so one of the key differences between the ARI and the AGI is that the rent increase lifespan of the ARI is in perpetuity. And whereas AGIs, it's only the weighted useful life of the expenditure. And so in talking to the director of the RTB, they mentioned that they kept it in perpetuity because they believed that tenants would likely have moved out by the end of the weighted useful life. So they just opted to keep it in place. And furthermore, for contesting this process, tenants in BC must seek dispute resolution if they feel the ARI should not be granted, whereas in Ontario, tenants can challenge the AGI at the landlord and tenant board. So who are the financialized landlords that are operating in the Metro Vancouver and Toronto rental market? So on the right, you can see that Toronto does. These are some of the major companies. Toronto does have a lot more large financialized corporations operating in the primary rental market. And then In the middle, you can see these are the companies that that we've observed through our acquisitions database, as well as our ARI database, that are operating in both markets. And I'll just call your attention to BCI at the top. So this is British Columbia Investment Management Corporation. This is the asset management arm of British Columbia's public sector pension. And then I'll also highlight Starlight Investments, InterRent REIT and Crestpoint, and Hollyburn Properties. So we'll come back to those companies later. Some of these might be very familiar to you. So this is the capital expenditures sort of guideline straight from the policy for the ARIs. And like I said, these policies, we wanted to know whether financialized landlords are sort of pursuing these at a higher rate than other landlords, and how this ARI policy might fit into their business and management practices of maximizing revenue at their property, and increasing the valuation of the building, to then turn around and sell it at a significant profit. And again, these are capital expenditures. Some things are very much needed work that needs to get done in these buildings. However, we do argue that it shouldn't be the responsibility of the tenants to pay for these things. The landlords purchase the buildings. Often they're purchasing much older purpose-built rental buildings that might already be in a state of disrepair. And we argue they're doing so knowing that they can then turn around and capitalize on the age and wear of these properties through the ARI policy. And so what we did was we categorized all of the landlords into financialized landlord, which is an asset management firm, private equity fund, pension fund manager like BCIMC, a real estate investment trust like CAPREIT, or a publicly traded company like Main Street Equity. Individuals acting in their own capacity. So these are just individuals who own a building or property in their own name. This is often stuff in the secondary rental market, so like duplexes and triplexes. And then private investors, these are small corporations for which limited information is available online. These are also small family-owned property management companies. And so what we did find was that financialized landlords accounted for almost 60% of ARIs, of ARI impacted units during the study period, so from 2021 to 2023. And importantly, we can see that they're about almost double the second leading landlord type. So this should be concerning for policymakers and housing advocates. And so this table illustrates ARIs filed by landlord type. And so not just those that are granted, but also those that are still pending, cases that were withdrawn or cases that were dismissed. So again, we can see that financialized landlords have the largest number of units, both impacted by the policy and also potentially impacted through their 5 cases that are still pending. One of the limitations of this data is that we don't know why cases were withdrawn. We also do not know why cases were dismissed. And furthermore, we don't know exactly what the expenditures were that relate to these ARIs. So we can't see if there is a pattern forming there, and that sort of limits researchers in their understanding of, are our landlords getting away with including cosmetic renovations under the guise of doing larger capital expenditures at the same time. And so something I should also mention is that private investors and numbered companies, some of these companies, they may be tied to a larger parent organization, but as I'm sure many of us are aware, financialized landlords and asset management firms specifically, there's a lot of sort of secrecy in the way that they own their assets. So they'll often own them through subsidiary companies with ambiguously named ambiguous names like 123 Main Street, and numbered companies as well. We can't always tie them to a larger company, and this also has to do with the fact that these companies, we would have to pay a significant amount of money to determine, who the directors are of these companies, and then tie those directors back to a parent company. And so who are the top landlords in Metro Vancouver who are filing ARIs? What we found was that BCIMC, again, the asset management arm of BC's public sector pension, has filed they haven't filed the most ARIs, but they have the most ARIs impacted units at 785. And then Hollyburn as well filed the most ARIs. And so here we can see a couple of quotes from these leading landlords filing ARIs. Hollyburn invests in older, poorly managed buildings, renovates and upgrades the building's infrastructure, transforming the suites into high-end rental suites. So we argue that sort of the ARI policy fits well in line with their sort of profit maximization and repositioning strategies. And then Crestpoint Real Estate Investments and Interrent, they applied for 3 ARIs through joint venture. They purchased these properties in 2021, and then the policy came into effect, and they immediately filed 3 ARIs. So we can see that it seems like they may be strategically pursuing these. And this quote comes directly from their website as well, repositioning strategically located income-producing multi-residential properties. So, and another part of this study that we wanted to do was to sort of see how these findings compare with landlords who are filing the most above guideline rent increases in Toronto. And so our findings from previous research, looking at AGI applications in the city of Toronto from 2010 to 2022, we found similar findings, financialized landlords accounting for just under 60% of all AGIs filed. So this is AGIs filed, not units impacted. But then when we look at units impacted and AGIs filed, we can see CapREIT, BCIMC, and Hollyburn all make the top 10. And these are 3 companies that are also quite active in the Metro Vancouver market in terms of acquisitions, but also, if you remember from the previous table, they're also filing ARIs. So this is sort of concerning, and it could be sort of like a forewarning of what is to come in the Metro Vancouver rental market with this new policy that's just in its infancy. And so just to summarize everything that I just said, basically financialized landlords have topped the list by both applications filed, but more importantly, units impacted by ARIs. And these are units in purpose-built rental housing. This is often some of sort of the last affordable housing that is not social housing. And so, as we all know, this type of housing is steadily being eroded by some of these companies, and ARIs could potentially be another strategy for landlords to squeeze more and more profit out of these buildings. We also found that 78% of all ARIs filed by financialized landlords were approved at the time we received the data. However, that doesn't include the 5 cases that are still pending, of which there could have been an outcome, but we don't know that right now. And further to summarize, landlord types filing ARIs in Vancouver strongly resemble those filing AGIs in Toronto. And so, yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you for listening. And I'll pass it over to Alina now.
Thanks, Dimitri. Really great to have you present on that. And I'm going to be presenting on some data that we collected a little bit earlier than Dimitri's. So jumping back in time. Yeah, I'll introduce myself and share my slides as well. Just a moment. So I'm Alina McKay, and I'm the research manager for the balanced supply of housing. And I'm going to be presenting today on filling the gaps, evictions and government policy in Metro Vancouver during COVID-19. So this presentation, just going to give you a quick overview before I jump in. So I'll start with a land acknowledgement, provide a bit of a timeline because we are going back to COVID policies, an overview of the data that we looked at, key findings, some limitations, as well as my conclusions. So I'm going to start with this map. This is a map of Metro Vancouver, but it's probably one that you may or may not be familiar with. It shows the territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples, as well as many of the other First Nations that had territory in the Metro Vancouver region. And this is unceded territory, and often the word unceded is skipped over in land acknowledgements. But I do want to take some time today to acknowledge that unceded is really around evictions. It's a form of not recognizing traditional rights and land entitlement of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh, as well as the other nations that are listed here. So when we're thinking about the pandemic and the impacts of the pandemic, and also how evictions disproportionately impact Indigenous folks in the Metro Vancouver region and across Canada, I think remembering that the displacement of people from unceded territories is fundamental to thinking about eviction research and responding to it as well. So I'm going to return to thinking of some of the considerations that need to be taken into account around First Nations in my conclusions, but I want to turn first to the central research question that we set out to explore and that we'll be looking at in this presentation. So the question is, did rental protections and income supports have the intended result of ensuring that households did not lose housing due to lost income and economic hardship during the pandemic? So I'm going to take you back to April 9th, 2020, when it was announced that the BC government reassures renters that they will not be evicted if they cannot pay rent during the state of emergency related to COVID-19. The announcement goes on to say that there'll be an additional $500 benefit that will be provided to renters on top of federal income supplements of $1,000 in funding available through BC's emergency benefit for workers. So because this is going back in time a bit, I also wanted to remind everyone of some of the policies that were in place, and those that aren't familiar with BC, because it was province by province, this will also be a refresher for some of the BC policies that were in place. So first of all, in March of 2020, a rent freeze was introduced, and that went all the way until January of 2022. And that really meant that landlords couldn't increase rent by any amount within this period. The next policy that was brought into place was an eviction moratorium, and that was from the end of March 2020 and all the way to, it says September here, but it was really the end of August of 2020. And this eviction moratorium is important to understand because some of the findings will seem contradictory to it. So this was a ministerial order that made it so that evictions could be granted, but they couldn't actually be enforced. So a tenant could receive an order, or a landlord could receive an order of possession, but they weren't actually enforceable during this period of time. There was also the BC temporary rent supplement program that came into effect from April of 2020 to August of 2020. And then an evictions really were allowed for things other than unpaid rent as of June 2020. So it was a fairly short period that the eviction moratorium actually impacted all types of evictions. The other lines here, I'm not going to go into them in more detail, but they also outlined other benefits that were available to workers for lost income to account for COVID-19. The other thing I'll just bring a last people's attention to is that renters were provided with an opportunity to repay rent that was missed between the March and August period of 2020. And they were able to have repayment plans that were, as long as they repaid any rent that had been missed until July of 2021. So those were mandatory repayment plans that were introduced by the province. So the data that we're drawing on for this study is, first of all, eviction filings. We looked at eviction filings and disputes, both from landlords and tenants from 2010 to June of 2022. And we also received data around the forward sortation areas. So forward sortation areas, they're the postal code within the city, and they allow us to look generally what area evictions were happening at. And they're around like a neighborhood. Robson area, if people are familiar with Metro Vancouver, would be an FSA, for example. We also drew on 2021 census data, as well as BC Centre of Disease Control data, but this was at a much higher level. It's at the local health authority, which can contain quite a few FSAs within it. So jumping into the actual findings, the first finding really is around eviction filings and the impact of the moratorium. So this graph shows the total number of eviction filings are the line in blue here. And we see in 2020 a really sharp decline in filings and disputes that were brought to the residential tenancy branch. One thing to keep in mind here is that eviction filings that start with O are from a landlord, and eviction filings that are, or disputes that come from a tenant disputing a notice to end tenancy start with a C. So we're really focusing in this analysis on eviction or notices to end tenancy and disputes around unpaid rent, so with an R at the end, and then as well as unpaid utilities, as well as for cause. So the green line at the bottom, you can see, generally speaking, there's fewer evictions for cause in the Metro Vancouver region just historically, but there was a dip in terms of the actual number of disputes and filings that were made to the residential tenancy branch in 2020. And then it comes back to sort of generally those same levels by 2021. The yellow line here again is OPR, so disputes around unpaid rent or unpaid utilities. And then once again, those dip quite a bit in 2020 and then jump back up. And another important thing to note here is that these actually don't go down to zero. So we don't actually see we see a decrease in eviction filings and dispute filings, but not a stop. So that would be the main thing to take home there. The next really jumps into a more detailed look at the trends in disputes and filings between 2019, which is this light blue line here, 2020, which is the yellow line, 2021, where we see a similar line to 2019, and then 2022, where we only have data until June of 2022. And once again, we see a similar trend to 2019 and 2021. So 2020 is the year where the eviction moratorium comes in. It's this blocked off gray area here, so between March and September. And we see that the number of filings and disputes really is impacted throughout that period of time. However, what is interesting but also surprising, that surprised us in the analysis, was that the actual decisions made by the residential tenancy branch, so adjudicators that actually looked at these cases, these decisions weren't really impacted by the evictions moratorium. So there is an exception. So this green line here is OPC, so eviction filings for cause by landlords in this case. So all of these lines deal with notices to end tenancy that are submitted by landlords to the residential tenancy branch. So this green line really shows in March, there's no filings that are made in March of 2020. However, by April, 50% of filings, so arbitrators for the residential tenancy branch ruled in favor of an order of possession to the landlord. In May, that dropped down to 40% of decisions, but throughout this period of time, so decisions around unpaid rent, so these yellow lines, and unpaid utilities really didn't change in terms of the types of decisions that were being made. So we continue to see orders of possession being granted to landlords at similar rates, so around 65 to 75% throughout 2020 and 2021. And I'll jump into sort of why we think that's happening a little bit later on. The next thing to note is that in 2020, we start to see a really severe increase in the time that it actually takes for a residential tenancy branch to respond to eviction filings. So there's a big difference as well between the response time to landlords that are filing and notice to end tenancy with the residential tenancy branch So OPR here so these are filings around unpaid rent. There's about, by 2022, it takes about 57 days, so almost 2 months for the RTB to respond to a notice to end tenancy for unpaid rent, and 71 days for unpaid utilities. However, for the actual tenants that dispute a filing for unpaid rent or unpaid utilities, by 2022, it's taking up to 100 days or 108 days. So, more than 3 months for the RTB to actually respond to disputes. So there's a major difference between, the difference between when the residential tenancy branch is responding to landlords and when it's responding to tenants is almost twice as much time that it takes to actually respond to a filing. This last map, so this is the last sort of piece of the findings that I'm going to be talking about, is looking at a number of different indicators that we mapped together. So going back to the pandemic, we were also interested in the impact of pandemic supports on visible minority groups. So we looked at patterns of visible minority groups within Metro Vancouver for both all visible minority groups, so the proportion of the FSA that identified as a visible minority, as well as for Asian visible minorities. And specifically, we looked at South Asian, Southeast Asian, West Asian, Korean, and Filipino groups because these groups, first of all, experienced greater hardship during the pandemic as reported by StatsCan in terms of job loss and the financial hardship. But also there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment in Vancouver. So there is also a point that needs further, exploration because of that. So we looked at the patterns in terms of the proportion of the FSA that was a visible minority, both Asian visible minority or total visible minority, as well as the proportion of the FSA that was in core housing need. So, not able to move to affordable housing or in core housing need because of being unsuitably housed, inadequately housed, so needing major repairs or also unaffordable, as well as the proportion of the population that received EI or COVID benefits. And then also the final one was around eviction filings. So the blue parts in this map show, where FSAs that experience lower proportion of visible minority populations, in this case specific to Asian visible minority populations, as well as below average EI and COVID benefits, below average, and then below average eviction filings as well. The yellow areas, on the other hand, show areas where all of these were higher. So areas where there was higher visible minority populations, higher levels of income support uptake, as well as higher eviction filings. And one of the things that we think was happening is that even though pandemic protections did play some role in protecting people against unfair evictions, these yellow areas really show areas that were disproportionately impacted by both COVID and evictions as well. So that was another of the key findings. So I do want to jump into some of the limitations of this data because I think they're important to consider when thinking about the findings and the implications of the findings as well. So the first limitation to this is that this is really capturing only formal eviction filings. So filings that have an administrative record with the residential tenancy branch. And so informal evictions are not captured by these formal eviction filings. And that's a real problem, especially when we know that, so if you think back to the graph where we saw the percentage of eviction filings that are to the residential tenancy branch for unpaid rent or unpaid utilities, RTB data would suggest that those make up a huge proportion or most of eviction filings. However, Canadian Housing Survey data suggests that actually quite a few forced moves, especially in BC, are due to no fault of the tenant. So it's because of sale of property or landlord use. So a lot of informal evictions are not being captured by these residential tenancy branch administrative records. The second limitation is really around the residential tenancy data being difficult to access. There was major gaps in the eviction data, and one of like the data being difficult to access was part of that. But there was also a lack of property data that was not released. So eviction research that's being done in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, for example, by Nemoy Lewis and others, they've been able to actually map the properties that are being impacted by these and can tell us about financialized landlords versus non-financialized landlords and things like that. And we just aren't able to do that type of analysis with this data because of the lack of property level data. There's also no collection of demographic characteristics. And this is a real weakness because we can't actually create responsive policies in terms of who's being evicted as well as who's being more impacted by evictions. So the previous map that I showed you really does point to this Surrey being more impacted by evictions, which is also an area that sees a higher proportion of visible minority. But we can't really actually say whether evictions are impacting visible minority populations in Surrey more than other populations in Surrey because of the lack of demographic characteristics and disaggregated race-based data. So just to bring this home, so the evictions map that was provided by First United and Sarah Marsden, their survey, which has had lots of people that responded to it by now. I think it's over 500, but probably more by now. So 45% of Indigenous renters in BC that responded to the eviction survey had not found a place to live after being evicted, compared to 23% of non-Indigenous renters. So there really is a disproportionate impact that evictions have on certain types of renters, in this case, Indigenous renters in BC. The next limitation is really around tenants limited to tenants that have rights through the Residential Tenancy Act. So we know, for example, that there's lots of groups that are excluded from the Residential Tenancy Act. That includes students living in residence, residents of long-term care homes, and people experiencing homelessness or hidden homelessness. So, for example, someone couch surfing during the pandemic had no rights under the Residential Tenancy Act and couldn't really have, without those rights, was also didn't have the security of tenure. And then the last limitation is really that the COVID data that's available in British Columbia is at the local health authority area. So at a much higher level than the Fort Sortation area. And this also makes it difficult to tell who and what was impacted. So moving on to conclusions. So first of all, the evictions moratorium had a limited impact on decisions made by the RTB. So going back to thinking of that graph that I shared, or the figure that I shared that showed the actual decisions that were made by the RTB, we see very little impact of the eviction moratorium on the actual decisions. It continued to favor landlord applications to evict tenants at similar rates to before the eviction moratorium. The next piece is that wait times for hearings increased from 2020 to 2022 and impacted tenants more than landlords. So just again, that point that tenants waited almost, in some cases, more than twice as long as landlords to actually have their decision heard by the RTB. That Surrey was especially impacted by evictions. And then in my final slide, I'll just share some of the responses that might make sense given these findings. So the eviction moratorium, right, it did have a limited impact on the actual decisions. And part of that is because residential tenancy branch adjudicators lack the ability to consider the actual hardship that eviction might bring on to the tenant. So to introduce a proportionality provision in the Residential Tenancy Act would give adjudicators the ability to actually look at alternative to evictions. And that's something that's just not available right now. The next thing is that, right, in response to the fact that wait times for hearings has really impacted tenants that dispute a hearing more than landlords that actually put forward a hearing. So improving procedural fairness is a really important response to this, including tenants being mandated that they obtain a hearing within a reasonable time. So just ensuring that those times that there's more parity between them. So Surrey being especially impacted by evictions and filings, we need to collect and disseminate demographic data that allows for better understanding of who's being evicted, as well as the rights to not be evicted for equity deserving groups. And then last but not least, better data would contribute to more responsive policies and help protect affordable housing. So requiring landlord applications to be filed with the RTB prior to issuing an eviction is a really important piece to actually ensuring that we're getting a better picture of evictions and that there's not bad faith evictions that are happening. And there's also a link there to some of the really great work that First United is doing around responding and reducing bad faith evictions, as well as their platform for legal reform. So that concludes the presentation, and thanks everyone for your time.
Okay, I guess we'll start the Q&A. Thanks so much, both Dimitri and Alina, for your presentations today. So folks, if you do have questions for either of our presenters, feel free to pop them in there. And it looks like we have a couple questions that are in here now. So I'll start with these ones. Wow, it looks a little bit more my comment, but I imagine that you'll probably have something, Dimitri, maybe this is something you can comment on, is a few of these REITs have been assembling multifamily complexes in White Rock and South Surrey with market rent increases imposed. Well, it looks like there's a lot of folks that have a lot of things to say about some bad deals that their buildings are, but do you have any data or information about kind of the assembling of multifamily properties for increases?
I don't have details about the assembling for specifically for increases, like applying for ARIs, but I do have information about like basically all multifamily property transactions that occurred in Metro Vancouver between, I think it was 1999 and 2022. So if those properties were transacted within that period, then that's something that I would be able to find out. Just looking at the rest of the question. Yeah, so if there is a property that you're interested in knowing, if anyone's interested in knowing the owner of, I'm sure that we can find that information for them.
Great, thanks, Dimitri. Alina, I see you're typing an answer, but I think this would be useful information for everyone. What are the eviction codes that you used to follow for the report?
Yeah, for sure. So we focused on evictions for cause, as well as those are OPC and CNC evictions, and then also for unpaid rent or utilities. So OPR, OPU, and CNR.
And were there any kind of issues with the codes as they are laid out? Is there any overlap or concern with the way that it's reported by the RTB?
Yes, yeah, there was so Marika DeAngelis did a lot of the data analysis for us, so that was amazing. She's really helpful. But there definitely was overlap, and we did give so when there was multiple codes, we also looked at those as well. So and how those multiple codes often came together.
Great. This is maybe for both of you, and Alina, you touched on kind of ways that government can be better in your presentation. We have a question wondering how, from the tenant side, is like what can folks do when there are irregularities in AGIs or ARIs? How can they report? How can they speak up? And what are the downfalls? Just anecdotally, I know that there's a huge imbalance of power between tenants and landlords. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I guess I can go first. So to the question, how can we report irregularities when tenants are afraid to speak up and report? So I would definitely say connecting with tenant unions in whatever area you're living there. I'm not super familiar with the Metro Vancouver sort of landscape because we're living here in Toronto, but I know that like Vancouver Tenants Union does a lot of good advocacy work, but there are, at the smaller scale, there are like maybe tenant unions in your neighborhood and community legal clinics that can assist you in fighting maybe an ARI. Like since ARIs are so new, I can't say specifically, but when it comes to fighting like above guideline increases in Toronto, we have seen that tenant unions have worked, together with community legal partners to help them in that process because it's not a small undertaking to fight one of these.
Alina, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add that some really interesting work is being done in Toronto, not Vancouver, so not Vancouver specifically, but there is really interesting advocacy that's happening around rent strikes and things like that, where tenants are really collectively organizing to say, like often above rent increase will impact a whole building. And then especially when we think about Vancouver, those increases happening in perpetuity, that's potentially hundreds of dollars of increases over a longer, like when you think about a 10-year period of time, for example. So really pushing people into incredibly unaffordable. If they're not already struggling with affordability, those types of increases will likely impact affordability. So I think, yeah, some of the sort of organizing that's happening within buildings and things like that, and tenant unions are one example where collectively that voice can be a little bit louder than individually. It is difficult though, especially given how Dimitri spoke to this a bit, but just like how and when a above rent increase comes into effect, the tenants have to dispute it individually. So like the actual way that and this is my understanding of it, I might be understanding it wrong, but yeah, they have to dispute it individually. So it doesn't actually allow for collective organization in the same way. So there isn't also a need for more collective ways for people to dispute things like above rent increases.
Thanks so much. Do we have any data or information about ARIs or evictions in other jurisdictions outside of Vancouver and Toronto?
So I guess I can speak to that. So the ARI is only in BC. We don't have information regarding additional rent increases outside of Metro Vancouver. But in terms of AGIs, we have cleaned and categorized AGIs for the city of Ottawa, as well as Mississauga. And we see the exact same thing. In fact, it's even more like pronounced. Like you see financialized landlords dominating the list of companies who are applying for AGIs in Mississauga. Like over 60% of AGIs filed there, and then same thing in Ottawa as well. And so I don't know if this type of policy exists in other provinces across the country. But I suspect if it did, you would probably see have similar findings. And then I could answer the question about the AGI from Rosemary. AGIs, so you say that the AGI has not been rolled back, and that's something we actually have heard as well. They're supposed to be rolled back when they file them. There's like, they list the weighted useful life of whatever work they did. So it's like usually no more than like 15, 17 years. So there are a few AGIs that should definitely be expiring now or expiring soon. And I'm sure that the landlords probably don't want tenants to know that. So I would say if you're looking to, and they're actually supposed to reduce your rent by the amount that it was, you know, increased. So maybe talking to a tenant union or talking to someone like the Federation of Metro Tenants Association and see what sort of support that they could give you, because that's something that needs to be brought to more people's attention. So thanks for bringing that up, Rose.
Great. Thanks so much. I just want to add also on the piece about outside of like ARIs and other jurisdictions. Obviously, there's the great work done by the Balanced Supply of Housing maps a lot in BC, Ontario, and also in Quebec. There's also a lot of provinces that do not have rent control. And so there's no such thing as an above guideline increase because they can increase rent however they want legally. So food for thought. Alina, question for you, maybe, and I don't know, Dimitri, you might be able to contribute. Does Landlord BC challenge any findings? So I guess in the few cases where the tenant is ruled against, does Landlord BC or commercial landlords as a group, do they end up challenging anything? Do they have any role in that, or is it always between individual renters and landlords?
I can't speak to evictions. Maybe Lena could do that, but I could speak to Landlord BC and ARIs. But if Lena, if you want to go first.
No, go ahead, Dimitri.
So something we did find was that Landlord BC openly boasts about leading a lot of the conversation around like the forming of the ARI policy. So they worked directly to inform, you know, its creation. And in terms of challenging, I'm sure they would challenge our findings. I did read in a couple articles from Vancouver publications where Dave, I think his name is David Hutniak, who's the like chair or CEO of Landlord BC, said, you know, like we're doing these renovations, but tenants benefit, you know, they benefit from them. And this is just sort of the market. This is how the market works. Like, you know, we need to do these repairs. But the problem is, it's like, he doesn't have an argument for it. It's like, why should the tenants be paying for these things, right? Like when they buy a building, there are costs of maintaining a building. And what these policies sort of do is allow those costs to be passed on to the renters. And we believe that's not fair. I would think that they would strongly dispute this. And you said they often cherry pick data and reports. Yeah, the Landlord BC is a big lobby. Like, also one of the board members of Landlord BC is like the president of Hollyburn, I believe. So, you know, you can see where that will get you. Nemoy, your hand is raised.
No, I was just going to add that, you know, it's one thing to be cognizant of how these policies are currently being used, is that they're currently being used as a revenue generating tool for a lot of these landlords, because it enables them to unlock whatever untapped value that's in the actual asset, which would be the purpose-built rental itself that they own. And so it allows them, in a sense, to circumvent rent control, to be able to make all these improvements to the property in order to also exacerbate some of the affordability problems some of the long-standing tenants would face as a result of these increases in the higher rental rates. But as in turn, they are doing them also for the sole purposes of being able to attract more affluent renters to their properties, as we saw with the statement that was Dimitri had posted with respect to Halliburton's strategies in terms of trying to attract more affluent and desirable renters to their properties.
Thanks. Alina, did you want to add?
I don't think I have anything to add to that. Yeah, there wasn't, like, this report hasn't been released yet for the balanced supply of housing, so we haven't had any direct, yeah.
And keep an eye out for it. We will be releasing the report this week, and we'll send a copy to everyone registered for the webinar. But we are just a couple minutes shy of the hour, so I'm going to close the questions there and thank everyone so much for attending. And we look forward to engaging more on these topics. Make sure you register for the other research in progress as the series continues on for the next few months. Thanks so much, everyone.